Some games aren't games in the traditional sense. They aren't oriented around twitch actions, strategic plays, and free range of exploration. Some games instead are like Citizen Sleeper, essentially visual novel-like experiences that expect you to read hours of text describing varying scales of conflict. It's a game that doesn't threaten death around every corner. Instead, it guides you toward the finish, so long as you continue clicking through its user interface-focused presentation. There are dice rolls that you're forced to rely on for every action, but these dice rolls are more often than not just there to determine the speed at which you accomplish goals. There are rarely drastic consequences to failure here. You're just a member of an adrift space station called Erlin's Eye, and you have to live here and survive, and that means you have to work. The dice rolls are checks on your ability to do each of the jobs that you take on for yourself. And so this becomes a game of stacking quests or stacking tasks in a small space that you become eminently familiar with. By developing relationships on the station, you gain more opportunities for work, and you also begin to learn more about the culture and the world that you're in, and you begin to learn more about the troubles of the people that you're working with. But there is a basic challenge to connecting to those you meet. You're different than everyone else.
Wake up, sleeper. Your body is dying.
You're what's called a sleeper, a company-owned robotic vessel that people can get paid to make a copy of their consciousness and placed into that vessel. And then the company owns both the vessel and the consciousness, and they do work for these companies. You're untethered now from the company that designed your body, which is Essen Arp. You don't know much of an origin beyond that. You don't know anything about your original person. The confusion that you start with as a player, I think, matches very much like the confusion of the character, because you really are just in this space of disorganized communities. And you meet someone from the very, very beginning, and he's a kind of worker, and he talks to you, and he's very nice to you. But there's a kind of sternness underneath. You need to prove your worth or your value in this place. And that seems to be the ongoing story that pulls on the structure of the gameplay. You're constantly proving yourself through work. And people are very skeptical of you because, like, you aren't human, right? There's sort of this fascination with what you're made of. But that's sort of a concept that comes up throughout the whole thing, is people are very seriously disturbed by how they identify with each other or with you. Identity really matters because there is no, like, single control, and yet everyone is so eager to organize and divide themselves.
There's something really cool that the game does where it relatively quickly starts to reveal that you're really not particularly different from everybody else around you. You fit in better than you thought you would, and you sort of find that you actually are building relationships with people that go beyond just the favors that they ask of you, right? That's always sort of the introduction. It felt like a visual novel that sort of, at the very least, puts you in the mindset of daily life, which is, I think, more difficult to do outside of a game context.
The gameplay is that daily life. One of the first ways that you begin to relate to these characters is the fact of your need to be sustained. Because you're reliant on this proprietary substance, this medicine that keeps your condition high, you have to work. And even though it seems so artificial, the fact that you're taking this capsule to maintain your condition, it really is exactly analogous to the living human bodies that are on the station that also need to survive and therefore also need to work. You're trapped in the same condition that they are, in spite of the fact that your physical condition is physically distinct and separate from everyone else. That superficial separation in terms of first meeting every member of the station is paramount. Many of them acknowledge, oh, you're a sleeper, you're one of these robots. But the fact of the matter of their existence is the same as yours. As you talk to them, the fact of the matter of your emotional state and the ways in which you interact with the world is so similar to theirs. And the gameplay is sort of reinforcing that grind. One of the things that's tough about playing this game, and it was a little tough for me because I did get somewhat tired as I kept playing, there is a kind of mundane repetition to your days. You really are living out days. There's cycles that you're choosing to start again and again and again, and you're repeating a lot of the same tasks. That boredom that you might feel, or that repetition, is very much like a performance of what the character is experiencing. There is a kind of overall drab tone to this space. It really is depressing in a lot of ways, and it's not depressing in the poetic, explicit way of like describing to you how dark and dank everything is. They make you feel moment to moment a dankness and a darkness and a drab sort of mundanity. So you continue living out this way, right? And you're just sort of doing these tasks and you're working. And that's what it feels like for long stretches of time. And for a game that is seemingly devoted to characters, for a big stretch of time at the beginning, you're not talking as much as I would have expected. And then there starts to become additional layers of pressure on your time beyond you just, needing to finish a job on a certain date. Because you are company property, the company starts to pay for bounty hunters to chase after the property to get it back. You very early on in the game meet one of these bounty hunters and they show up and it becomes like this threat. You have to start paying him off because he meets you and you think he's going to take you away. And then because you're in this station that is derelict and off the beaten path, presumably there's a kind of lawlessness attached to the station. And so this bounty hunter decides, oh, well, I don't have to take you home immediately. I can stay here for a little while. Which I found was a great bit of characterization because it kind of showed he really didn't care about what he was doing. It really was just a job. And that's so much of what everyone's doing is they're just fulfilling a task based on a checklist. He goes off and then he goes to a bar and he starts drinking, and that was a really good first character, I thought, because you start getting a tiny bit of complexity in terms of the people living in this space. And it suggests a little bit about the world beyond just the station, because the station is miserable, but it seems this bounty hunter's not too happy either.
You start to see his unhappiness pretty early on. After his first performance of sort of scaring you, you sort of immediately see that he's just a regular guy. The game definitely humanizes him, if not sympathizes with him at that point. He still comes across as a scumbag. The game does what it does best, I think. It starts telling you a story about who your enemy is. It starts telling you a story about the people you have to work for. It gets really weird after a while. So basically that quest line, you need to partner up with him to go after this other bounty hunter who got hired in his place because his contract was canceled, and then the contract was given to this much more esteemed bounty hunter. So now he's jobless and he needs to go to you to sort of figure out the situation, and he's kind of he's offering you a chance to survive this encounter with the other bounty hunter, but he's also trying to get back on his feet himself. That story is the first one that I finished because this game is basically a collection of short stories. And the ending was basically that they both end up dead. And then I walked off into the city and found that no one noticed.
It's a great story for this particular game because it does touch on what I found was a thread throughout the whole experience, which was these boundaries of relationships. So the bounty hunter begins his task, his job is to bring you back and you're just property. And then as soon as that contract is canceled, that role, that relationship that you had with him is now shifted because he doesn't have that job anymore, and now your identity is very different to him. It's suddenly you're useful in a way and he actually needs you for something. It's funny the way that how we identify someone or how we see the boundaries around our relationship with someone can determine so much what we notice about them. When he first meets you, you're nothing. He sort of mocks you and says, oh, go ahead and run away. And he makes all these little comments when he first meets you. And he's sort of treating you as just another number in that long list of contracts that he achieves. When push comes to shove, it becomes obvious that you're his equal, if not his better by the end.
Up until that last moment, it really almost seems like he might be your friend at some point. It's sort of building to that a little bit, where at the very least, he's a negotiating partner of some kind. But then abruptly he dies, and then you survive by way of killing this other bounty hunter. I thought that the narration at that point was really beautiful because it just emphasizes that it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Now that they're both dead, there's really no choice but to move on. There's nothing to be gained from pondering the exact meaning of that, because sometimes chance gives you a story in your life that doesn't have much meaning.
There is a consistency in tone. There's an overarching kind of bleakness to the whole thing, but it's also an unusual structure for the story because you are a main character, obviously, right? But I expected as we were going along to learn a lot more about you as a character and your personal struggles and what you were going through, almost like that Disco Elysium style of your character is really being molded by you as you go along. But what I found is because of the short story structure that it takes on, where each character you meet is going through their own personal arc and you're just sort of interacting with that, it really felt like the main influence that I was having, or at least the main interaction that I was having with the world, was strictly with these characters and not so much with my own struggles. The whole game is discovering the community on this station and just noting the interactions within it and the ways in which people connect to one another and the ways in which people suffer separate from one another. There's so much suffering where everyone could help each other so much if they just communicated a little bit more, if they just worked together. There's so much abundance in this space. Like one of the tasks that you do is to like clear out a biome, like a really overgrown space. And then if you clear it out, you can start like planting mushrooms and like making food and stuff. And like there's talk prior to you doing that of like cooks who need mushrooms and need food. And it's like, it's right there. No one seems to notice all of the abundance that's in this small space. And you just familiarizing yourself with that space again and again, you just start to make connections between people who otherwise were completely disconnected from one another. Because your character is viewed as less than human, precisely because your body is like physically not human, you aren't given the marker of significance among a lot of these characters that you're meeting. When you're exploring the station, it becomes very clear that there's all these different factions that exist separate from one another. By helping each one, you start to discover some of the benefits of being a pariah, a social pariah, or some of the benefits of being viewed as an outlier or someone on the outskirts of things. Precisely because you don't have a clear identifier that connects you with people, you actually have a better chance of just connecting with everyone. There's some really obvious directions that you can go with stories like this about like a capitalist future where characters are just forced to work daily and they sort of get consumed by their work and they're trapped. But one of the things that I found so notable about the actual experience of communicating with these characters and experiencing this world was a tether more to function to like the way people live and like the ways in which we're not only identified by our geography or by our class. Sometimes our identity becomes whatever social function we happen to perform. So like if we are a patient in a hospital, we get treated differently than if we are a cashier at a Starbucks versus if we are a YouTuber. Sometimes the ways in which we separate one another is not merely just by intangible permanent qualities that we are brought up with. Sometimes the things that define us are the social parameters that we end up in. And you as a character, because you're such an empty character almost, you end up being able to constantly keep switching what social parameter you're stuck in. Even though this is a far off future, and with future comes this sense of like connectedness, you know, like with the internet, we presumably are more connected than ever. There is also a self-isolating inclination that people still have, even as they get more and more connected. And you being so disconnected, you seem able to transcend that and like actually connect with people.
There's a role that you take on that perhaps is not so uncommon as far as storytelling. I mean, a lot of protagonists in stories are a fish out of water, they're out of place, right? But the interesting thing about this game's take on specifically identity is that you have an identity that has no rules to it yet. Nobody knows anything about sleepers, they just know that they're strange. They just know that they're not common, and you also don't know anything about your past. You don't have a sense of acculturation that's based on what you don't do yet. You don't know what you're allowed to do. You don't know what you're prohibited from doing. You are a self-defining being in a way that most people don't realize that they could be. You have a way of going into a space where people have a problem and suddenly finding that you are solving the problem quicker than anyone else does because you are actually interested in negotiating a bigger pie out of the situation. Like you're actually creating things that are new. You're creating opportunities that didn't exist before you showed up because nobody thought of the things that you think of. Even though you don't learn so much about how you, the player, fit into the story, you get to watch as your own usefulness creates an identity for you. It happens according to chance, and it happens according to something that's outside of your control, which is related to the theme of like lacking freedom at the beginning of the game because you're being sort of pursued and you're reliant on this corporation that no longer will feed you. There's a sense of like you're looking for your freedom, but what you find instead is something so much more complicated than freedom. You find that you can actually take comfort in not being able to control everything. Because when you can't control everything, you don't have to anymore. A lot of the stories, the way that they end has to do with that. At least like the way that I played, the choices that I made. It ended up resulting in usually a story about deciding to like take what life gives you and make something more rather than just like choosing from your options.
And how funny that a character that is strictly non-human has that very human realization of the sense of like, it reminds me so much of like existential philosophy and like what that was supposed to be all about. And that was this notion of like your existence precedes your essence, which is to say you're not defined already. You are just defining yourself. And once you notice that you are always defining yourself, that really you don't have to be what you were yesterday. You don't have to be what you were 1 second ago. That you can play act a different character if you so choose. This robot stumbles into that And it's one of those things that all these characters in this station have access to, but they don't seem to notice. And then in interacting with you, there's a kind of like blossoming of character amongst themselves and amongst you. You do develop close relationships with these people. It's sad the ways in which the divide is so stark at the beginning, you know, when they first meet you. Like, a lot of them bring up your artificiality. A lot of them bring up the fact that you're a sleeper. It's like they're constantly reminding you that you're different. And then the reality of the actual interaction is so the same. You guys aren't different. There's something really strong there. I respect that a game is just trying to be about relationships in that way. If there's some disappointment to the overarching experience, it would just be that it is about characters and relationships. It's not about a long-form plot in terms of that main character. After many, many hours of playing it, there is sort of this sense like, okay, it's a bit like Spiritfarer. We reviewed Spiritfarer, and you know, a big part of that experience is you're doing a series of menial tasks, and each of these tasks are stacking onto each other, a kind of like stack of quests. They're all slowly progressing one on top of the other. And then your reward for these quests is a series of little storylines that are mostly disconnected. And that's what Citizen Sleeper feels like, is a lot of tasks stacked on top of each other. And then your big reward is the end of a small storyline. But you're not being given a big storyline on top of that. I think Spiritfarer even had more of a bigger storyline connecting all the little storylines. And this one is much more just short stories. So anyone playing this would definitely have to go in understanding that. These are short stories, and the thing that really just connects them is what we talked about, which is just a general tone and a general theme. There's a lot of reading in this game, and the gameplay is a lot of rolls of the dice to get to more reading. While playing, I was just thinking to myself, like, is this good gameplay? Why is this a video game? Because so much of the story is imagined, right? You're reading the text and you're getting like little pop shots, snippets of like character photos and things. You're just imagining the interactions, and it's being described to you like, oh, this happens, and like, oh my god, look how crazy and stressful this is. And then you're still just imagining it. People are dying and you're imagining it. You're being forced to read, and I love to read, but video games aren't at the level of literature, in my personal opinion, in terms of actually like how well the reading experience is. What is the value of like visual novels or like games like this where you're just reading all the time?
I do think that the writing style stands out for me. So that was a big part of the appeal. I really did consistently just want to do the reading, regardless of what the gameplay was. I also did enjoy just the satisfaction of seeing how many things I'm juggling at once and just realizing like how many connections I have with all these characters. There's something about the visual representation of seeing a city from a bird's eye view and seeing all the people that matter to you, like in icons. I probably would have been less patient personally with the kind of small scale nature of the stories if it weren't a game, because the main character is sort of nebulous. The main character doesn't end up becoming some brand new type of person other than in the fact that they are not like a particular type of person. It just becomes about like doing something over and over. It feels like something that I found very relatable.
Yeah, you don't end up being the hero. That's definitely unexpected. You sort of just exist, and I guess that fits.
If the writing doesn't hit you, it's not really going to work.